Imagine standing outside the richest city on earth. Behind you, the largest army you have ever commanded. Tens of thousands of men. Siege engines built to crush lesser cities into rubble. Horses, supply trains, engineers, the accumulated military knowledge of an empire, maybe two empires. You have studied the maps. You have counted the defenders. By every calculation that has ever mattered in the history of warfare, this city should fall within days. Ahead of you, a wall. Just a wall, stone and brick, rising out of the earth like something that has always been there, that will always be there, indifferent to your ambition. You give the order. Ladders go up, rams swing forward. The first assault begins. And then something strange happens. The wall does not simply resist you, it seems to anticipate you. Arrows come from angles you didn't expect. Your siege towers, built for months, become useless the moment they reach the base of the defenses. Men who cross one obstacle find another waiting behind it, and then another behind that. What should have taken days becomes weeks. What should have taken weeks becomes months. Then, one morning, your army is simply gone. Not defeated in a single dramatic battle. Worn down, starved, broken by disease, by logistics, by a defensive system that never had to win a single glorious victory because it never needed one. It only needed to make you fail slowly enough that failure became inevitable. This happened to Attila the Hun. It happened to the armies of the early caliphate, twice. It happened to Slavic princes, Bulgarian Khans, and Rus warlords sailing down from the north in long ships loaded with plunder and ambition. Generation after generation, century after century, the greatest military powers on earth arrived at the gates of one city and left having learned the same lesson. For more than 800 years, this single defensive system stopped every army that tried to break it. So the question is not whether it worked. History already answered that. The question is how. What made a line of walls, built by a Roman emperor who was barely a teenager and who never once commanded an army in his life, into the most successful piece of military engineering the world has ever produced? Most people assume the answer is simple. Bigger walls, taller stone, more soldiers. That assumption is wrong. It wasn't the height. It wasn't the number of defenders. It wasn't luck. And it wasn't even the legendary discipline of Roman engineering alone. It was something more elegant than brute strength. It was a system, a machine built from stone, water, geometry, and centuries of accumulated failure and correction. And to understand how it worked, we have to go back to the moment when the greatest city in the world realized it was standing naked. By the early 5th century, Constantinople had already outgrown itself. Founded by Constantine the Great roughly 100 years earlier on the site of the old Greek colony of Byzantium, the city had exploded in size, wealth, and population far faster than anyone had planned for. Constantine's original wall, built to protect a much smaller city, was no longer enough. Entire neighborhoods, markets, churches, and palaces had grown up outside its boundary, completely undefended, completely exposed. And the threats were not theoretical. To the north and west, the Roman world was cracking apart. Gothic tribes had already humiliated Roman armies in open battle. Beyond them, a new and terrifying power was rising on the Eurasian steppe, a confederation of horse warriors who would soon be led by a single ruthless name, Attila. Rome had already learned, at devastating cost, that its legions could be beaten in the field. If Constantinople could be beaten too, the eastern half of the empire, the wealthier, more populous half, would be finished. There was a deeper problem too, one that had nothing to do with tribes or armies and everything to do with geography. Constantinople occupied a peninsula bordered by water on two sides, the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Golden Horn to the north, which meant its natural defenses were already strong along most of its perimeter. But the western, landward side was different. It was the only approach where an army could simply march up to the city on solid ground, with no strait, no current, no natural barrier standing between an invader and the wealthiest markets, the grandest churches, and the imperial palace itself. Every strategist in the ancient world understood a basic truth. A fortress is only as strong as its weakest side. For Constantinople, that weakness was obvious, exposed, and growing more dangerous with every passing decade of the 5th century. The man who inherited this crisis was not a general. He was a child. Theodosius II became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire at the age of 7. The empire he nominally ruled was governed in practice by regents' ministers, and above all by his praetorian prefect, the empire's chief administrator, a brilliant and largely underappreciated figure named Anthemius. It was Anthemius who understood with startling clarity that the city's greatest vulnerability was not its army. It was its exposed western edge, the only side not protected by water. And it was Anthemius who set in motion the project that would define the city for the next 1,000 years. Construction began in the year 413. The goal was not simply to build a wall. The goal was to build something no army on Earth had ever successfully broken through, and to do it using a design so layered, so redundant, so mathematically brutal in its logic, that even a partial failure at any single point would not doom the city. Most people, when they imagine ancient fortifications, picture one wall, a tall barrier, soldiers on top, attackers below. That image is almost completely wrong when it comes to what rose along Constantinople's landward side. What the engineers of Theodosius II actually built was not a wall. It was a killing machine 4 layers deep. The first thing an attacking army encountered was not stone at all. It was a moat, nearly 20 meters wide in places, and up to 10 meters deep, which could be flooded using a system of sluice gates connected to the city's water supply. This alone eliminated an entire category of medieval and ancient siege tactics. Tunneling under the walls, one of the most reliable ways to collapse a fortification anywhere else in the world, became nearly impossible. Any tunnel dug toward the walls risked flooding or collapsing into the moat itself. Beyond the moat came a low outer wall, roughly 2 meters thick, punctuated by 96 towers of its own, standing on a terrace that gave defenders another platform from which to fire down on anyone who had somehow crossed the moat. Beyond that outer wall came an open strip of ground. A killing field, essentially, a space with no cover, exposed on every side to arrows and projectiles from both the outer and inner defenses. And beyond that killing field rose the true prize, the inner wall. Nearly 5 meters thick at its base and reaching heights of over 12 meters, studded with 96 massive towers of its own, spaced so precisely that no attacker could ever find a blind spot. Every tower's field of fire overlapped with its neighbors. There was no angle of approach, no position along nearly 7 kilometers of fortification, from which an attacking force could escape being seen and targeted from at least 2 directions at once. This is the detail people miss when they talk about the Theodosian Walls, as if it were one thing. It wasn't a wall. It was a sequence of obstacles designed so that surviving one simply delivered you into the next, weaker and more exposed than before. A siege tower that could be wheeled up to a single wall became almost useless against a moat, a second wall, and an open kill zone before it ever reached the real target. Battering rams that might crack an ordinary gate had to somehow first cross flooded ditches and climb terraces under constant fire. Picture what this actually meant for a soldier standing at the base of these defenses. He has already survived crossing open ground under arrow fire. He has already found a way past or through a flooded moat that swallowed comrades whole. He climbs the outer wall or breaches a section of it, only to find himself standing in a narrow strip of exposed earth with nowhere to hide, walls rising on both sides, defenders above him on 2 separate lines firing down into a space with no cover at all. This was not an accident of geography. This was the entire point. The killing field existed to turn survival into a trap. Every meter an attacker gained only exposed him more completely to the next line of defense waiting behind it. And this is where the genius of the system becomes clear. Most fortifications of the ancient world were built around a single question: how do we stop the enemy from getting in? The engineers who designed the Theodosian Walls asked a more sophisticated question: what happens to the enemy at every single stage of trying? Every layer wasn't just an obstacle. It was a trap calibrated to punish progress itself. The deeper an attacking force pushed, the more exposed, the more exhausted, and the more vulnerable it became. The opposite of how sieges were supposed to work everywhere else in the ancient world. Even the engineering choices that seem mundane were built around consequence rather than appearance. The inner wall's height wasn't chosen for intimidation. It was calculated so that no siege engine of the era could physically reach the top. The spacing between towers wasn't aesthetic. It was calculated so that defenders using the simple ranged weapons of the 5th century could guarantee overlapping coverage across every meter of approach. Nothing about the system was decorative. Every measurement existed to answer one question: what happens to an army that tries to cross this? And history did not wait long to test the answer. In the year 447, disaster struck, but it wasn't an enemy army. It was an earthquake. A massive tremor tore through Constantinople and collapsed large sections of the newly built walls, including dozens of towers. For a defensive system barely 3 decades old, this should have been catastrophic, and the timing could not have been worse. Attila the Hun, having already devastated much of the Balkans, was marching directly toward the city with his confederation of steppe warriors, an army that had by this point never lost a major engagement against Rome. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in ancient history, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. The people of Constantinople, not just soldiers but the city's population, organized by profession into work gangs, driven by the desperate knowledge that Attila was closing in, rebuilt the shattered walls in roughly 60 days. Not repaired. Rebuilt, and in the process, added an entirely new outer wall to the system, transforming what had been damaged into something even more formidable than before. Attila arrived to find not a broken city, but a strengthened one. He turned his army elsewhere, south, into the Balkans, and eventually toward Italy, leaving Constantinople untouched, not because he chose mercy, but because the calculation had changed. An army built for speed, for terror, for the psychological collapse of enemies who had never faced steppe cavalry before, had no answer for a static defensive system that simply refused to break. Attila's horsemen had ridden through half the Roman world without meeting serious resistance. At the edge of Constantinople, for the first time, they met a wall that didn't care how fast they rode or how many cities behind them had already burned. This is the first great reversal in the story of the Theodosian Walls, and it reveals something crucial about why the system worked for 8 centuries rather than 80 years. The walls were never a finished object. They were a living structure, constantly repaired, upgraded, and adapted by generations of engineers, administrators, and ordinary citizens who understood that the defense of the city depended not on a single triumphant moment of construction, but on relentless maintenance. But surviving an earthquake and a change of Hunnic strategy was only the beginning. Over the following centuries, the walls would be tested by nearly every major military power of the ancient and medieval world, and each failure, each near success, forced the system to evolve further. 6th century, the greatest threat came from 2 directions at once. In 626, while the main Byzantine army was fighting far to the east against the Persian Empire, a massive coalition of Avars, Slavs, and remaining Persian forces converged on Constantinople itself, believing the city, stripped of its field army, would finally fall. The Avars brought siege engines, the Slavs brought light boats to attack from the sea, and the Persians attempted to coordinate an assault from across the Bosphorus. It should have worked. Instead, the layered defenses held the landward assault to a standstill, while the Byzantine navy destroyed the Slavic boats attempting to ferry Persian reinforcements across the water. Without naval support, without a breach in the walls, and after unsuccessful direct assaults against the fortifications, the Avar coalition collapsed and withdrew. Constantinople had survived not because of one dramatic act of heroism, but because its defensive system had denied every attacker a way to combine their advantages into a single decisive blow. Notice what the walls had just done. They had neutralized a 3-way alliance between 3 separate military powers, each bringing a different kind of threat: Avar siege engines on land, Slavic naval mobility on the water, Persian numbers and discipline coordinating from across the strait, and none of it mattered, because the entire coalition depended on synchronizing an attack that the wall's layered geography made almost impossible to synchronize. A defensive system is usually judged by how it handles one enemy. The Theodosian Walls had just proven they could unravel 3 at once, simply by denying all of them the one thing every siege ultimately needs: a single exploitable point of weakness. Then came a threat unlike anything Rome, east or west, had ever faced. Within a single generation of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Arab armies had conquered Persia, Egypt, and most of the old Roman Near East. By the 6700s, the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate stood at the edge of Anatolia, and Constantinople itself became the target of a prolonged multi-year siege, remembered as the First Arab Siege, lasting from roughly 674 to 678. Here, the walls faced not a single dramatic assault, but a war of attrition, year after year, combined with a new weapon that terrified friend and foe alike: Greek fire, a Byzantine incendiary weapon that could burn on water, unleashed from Byzantine ships against the Arab fleet. Between the near impregnability of the land walls and the devastating effectiveness of Greek fire at sea, the Arab campaign ground to a halt and eventually withdrew, having lost enormous numbers of ships and men for no territorial gain at all. If that failure taught the Caliphate one lesson, it apparently wasn't enough, because in 717, the Arabs tried again, this time with even greater force, in what's remembered as the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople. This time, the attackers arrived with a massive army and fleet, prepared for a long siege, having learned from their earlier failure. What they had not fully accounted for was the brutal combination of a defensive system that could not be starved out quickly, a Byzantine emperor, Leo III, who understood the wall's strengths intimately, a catastrophically harsh winter, and Greek fire once again devastating their naval forces. By 718, the Arab army, decimated by hunger, cold, and repeated failed assaults, withdrew in what became one of the most consequential retreats in medieval history. Historians have long debated how differently the story of Europe might have unfolded had that siege succeeded. Consider the scale of what had just happened. This was not a minor border garrison holding off a raiding party. This was one of the most powerful military states the world had ever produced, fresh off conquering territory from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the mountains of Afghanistan, spending years and enormous resources trying to take a single city, and failing twice. Twice, the walls had turned the momentum of the fastest expanding empire in early medieval history into exhaustion, starvation, and retreat. If the Theodosian Walls had fallen in 718, the entire trajectory of the 8th century, the survival of Byzantium, the shape of the emerging conflict between the Christian and Islamic worlds, the security of southeastern Europe, could have unfolded in a completely different direction. Instead, the walls held, and history moved on around them, largely unaware of how close it had just come to a different outcome. By now, a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, even for the empire's enemies. Word of the failed sieges spread across trade routes, through diplomatic channels, in the accounts of merchants and travelers who passed beneath the walls and marveled at what they saw. Constantinople was gaining a reputation that no amount of gold or manpower seemed able to overcome. A city that could be threatened, blockaded, even terrorized, but never actually taken. And still, generation after generation, new powers rose along the empire's borders, convinced that they would be the exception. Century after century, the pattern repeated with different attackers and the same result. The Bulgarian ruler Khan, after crushing a Byzantine army in the field in 811, marched to Constantinople itself in 813, only to find, once again, that battlefield victory meant nothing against a city that simply could not be broken open by force. Twice, in the 9th and 10th centuries, fleets of Rus warriors, the early medieval ancestors of the Russian and Ukrainian states, sailed down from the north, in 860 and again in 941, hoping to plunder the wealthiest city they had ever seen. Both times they found a city that their light, fast warships and raiding tactics were never designed to conquer. Notice the pattern building across every single one of these episodes. Different attackers, different centuries, different tactics, different weapons, different cultures, different empires at the peak of their military power. And every single time the outcome was the same, because the fundamental problem the walls posed never changed. There was no fast way in, no shortcut. No weak point that stayed weak for long. Every besieging force was forced to play a game of patience against a city that could resupply itself by sea, repair its defenses continuously, and simply wait for hunger, disease, winter, or internal politics to break the attackers before the walls broke. This is the deeper truth the story keeps circling back to. It wasn't the height of the walls. It wasn't the number of defenders on any given day. It was the system, the moat that stopped tunneling, the outer wall that absorbed the first wave of any assault, the killing field that gave no attacker cover, the inner wall whose towers left no blind spot anywhere along 7 kilometers of fortification, and the political and logistical will to maintain, repair, and rebuild that system generation after generation. There is another factor that rarely gets the credit it deserves: the sea. Constantinople sat on a peninsula, protected on two sides by water and defended along its harbor by a massive chain that could be stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, physically barring enemy ships from entering. This meant that any attacker hoping to starve the city into submission first had to control the surrounding waters completely, something that proved shockingly difficult against a Byzantine navy that, for centuries, held a decisive technological edge thanks to Greek fire. A city that could still be resupplied by sea was a city that no siege, however large, could simply wait out. time, the one resource every besieging army eventually runs out of, worked against the attackers far more often than it worked against Constantinople. But if the walls were a machine, every machine eventually meets a force it wasn't built to withstand. By the middle of the 15th century, the empire that had once stretched from Spain to Persia had shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a handful of scattered territories. The Byzantine Empire, once the wealthiest and most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, was now a fraction of its former self, surrounded almost entirely by the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. And yet the walls still stood, the same fundamental design, refined and repaired across 1,000 years, still theoretically capable of resisting any medieval siege ever attempted against it. What changed was not the walls. What changed was warfare itself. In 1453, the young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II arrived outside Constantinople with an army that dwarfed the city's defenders many times over. But numbers alone had never been enough to break the Theodosian Walls before, and Mehmed knew it. What he brought instead was something the walls' original engineers, 13 centuries earlier, could never have anticipated: gunpowder artillery on an unprecedented scale. A Hungarian engineer named Orban, having failed to sell his services to the Byzantines, offered Mehmed something extraordinary: the knowledge to cast massive bronze cannons, some reportedly capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms. These were not the small, crude early cannons that had appeared occasionally in European warfare for decades already. These were purpose-built wall breakers, designed specifically to solve the exact problem that had defeated every army for the previous 1,000 years. How do you concentrate enough destructive force against a single point in a wall, built to distribute and absorb exactly that kind of pressure? For 53 days, Ottoman cannons pounded sections of the Theodosian Walls that had shrugged off Huns, Avars, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Rus. And section by section, the same stone that had defeated the ancient and medieval world began to crack under a force it had never been designed to resist. The Byzantine defenders, numbering only a few thousand against an Ottoman force many times larger, worked desperately at night to repair breaches made during the day, using improvised barricades, earth, and timber to plug gaps in walls that gunpowder was tearing open faster than exhausted defenders could rebuild. Even here, the system did not fail all at once. Emperor Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, organized his tiny garrison with a precision that echoed the same layered logic the walls themselves had been built on centuries earlier, concentrating defenders at the weakest points, rotating exhausted men, patching breaches through the night with whatever materials could be found. For 53 days, a defense that should have collapsed within a week held together through sheer will and organization, a final testament to how much the human element of the system still mattered even after its stone had begun to fail. On the May 29, 1453, after weeks of bombardment and a final, overwhelming assault, Ottoman forces broke through. Constantinople fell, and with it, the last direct continuation of the Roman Empire came to an end, nearly 1,500 years after Augustus. It's tempting to frame this as the moment the walls finally failed. That framing misses the point entirely. The Theodosian Walls were never defeated by a smarter general, a larger army, a more disciplined siege, or a cleverer strategy. Every one of those things had already been thrown at the walls repeatedly for 1,000 years, and every one of those things had failed. What finally succeeded against Constantinople in 1453 wasn't a better version of the same kind of warfare that had failed for a millennium. It was an entirely new category of warfare, one built around a technology the walls' original designers could never have imagined, let alone accounted for. In that sense, 1453 wasn't a defeat for the Theodosian Walls at all. It was the moment the age of the wall itself came to an end, not just in Constantinople but everywhere. Within decades, gunpowder artillery would force fortress design across the entire world to be reinvented from first principles, replacing tall vertical walls with the low, angled, earthwork-reinforced star forts that would define European military architecture for the next 3 centuries. Constantinople's walls didn't lose to a better wall breaker among medieval-style armies. They lost to the technology that made every wall like them obsolete everywhere forever. So what actually made the Theodosian Walls the greatest defensive system ever built? It wasn't a single wall of impossible height. It was layers, a moat, an outer wall, a killing ground, and an inner wall, arranged so that surviving one obstacle only delivered an attacker into the next. It wasn't a fixed monument. It was a living system, rebuilt after earthquakes, expanded after near disasters, maintained continuously across generations by a state that understood defense as an ongoing project rather than a finished achievement. It wasn't luck. Luck does not explain the same result repeating across 8 centuries, against Huns and Avars, Persians and Arabs, Bulgarians and Rus, each bringing their own strengths, their own innovations, their own certainty that this time would be different. It was intelligence, applied patiently and renewed endlessly against every new form of force the world could produce, until the world produced a force unlike any that had come before. The Theodosian Walls were never simply stone. They were centuries of engineering, strategy, logistics, maintenance, geography, and human ingenuity, working together as a single defensive machine. For more than 800 years, they proved that intelligence could outlast overwhelming force, and in the end, they were not defeated by a stronger wall. And yet, even in defeat, the lesson the walls taught never disappeared. Long after 1453, military engineers across Europe and Asia would study what had made Constantinople's defenses succeed for so long, and would carry that logic, layered defense, overlapping fields of fire, depth over height, redundancy over reliance on a single line, into the fortress designs of the centuries that followed. The stone eventually crumbled. The principle never did. They were defeated by a new age.